I am delighted to welcome Rob Price to the Business of AI podcast from UKAI. Rob, it's fantastic to have you here. Welcome.
Tim, thank you. Great to be here. Seems like we only did it yesterday. The other way round, of course.
That's right. I think that's one of the things we were just talking in the pre-chat about how good it is to be able to do these podcasts, because you actually get to have a conversation. That, we're going to have this, but also we get to share it with everybody else as well. And that for me is part of the advantage of being able to kind of chat to you, because you're such an experienced podcaster. Have you been doing a few more podcasts since I last saw you?
Just just a couple. One published already with a CEO of a AI business in Chicago, and the other kind of will be out shortly, but more surprises around that. But great conversation around the future of consulting industry. But the conversations just continue to happen, don't they? Because I think everyone's finding their feet in this kind of massive kind of ecosystem of innovation around AI, large language models, agents, agentic AI, etc. And it's not like there's a book that's been written that says these are the things that everyone should exactly do, exactly follow. And so therefore, I just think that they're a fantastic way of just sharing experiences and beginning to get each of our heads around these are the things that we all need to do to gain benefit, real kind of sustained benefit in some of the kind of work that we're all doing.
Exactly. I love it. You almost kind of like I think defined the point of having this podcast, really, which is the business of AI. Is what we call it. Is all about trying to delve into what makes a modern AI business. Because as I started to talk to a lot of our members, I realized that all of their businesses are very different, but there's some commonalities. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about that sort of that challenge of being able to keep up with the constant evolution of the technology, and then the impact that has on the organization as well, in terms of the skills people need to have. And we're going to get into that as well in a minute. But what I'm hoping to get from you, because I know you've got lots of experience in this field, is just some sort of examples and case studies of how businesses have gone through some of those changes. But I wonder whether we could just start with, can you tell us a bit more about, sort of your immediate background, how you got into AI, and in particular, Futuria? What does Futuria do, and sort of what's your USP?
Yeah, sure. I think the easiest way to describe my background is I've always kind of done interesting things with emerging technologies, and I've done that in large kind of global businesses, primarily Atos, actually, over many years. But the common theme has been doing that at scale. So many years ago, I worked with the Department of Transport on something called Transport Direct. It was the biggest .NET implementation in the world, using interesting data sets from Ordnance Survey that had only just been. So it's that common theme of whether it's public or private sector doing things at scale. Now, the perspective I often bring to a lot of this is as as somebody on the board. So I have been a consulting managing partner. I have been a chief operating officer. I was kind of chief digital officer, etc. So I'm looking at these technologies both in terms of as a service provider, providing them into organizations, but also as a consumer. So when I was COO of a payments business, how would I adopt a new application or a new technology like AI? And how would I ensure that it was robust, did what was expected, drove efficiencies, made sense financially? Now, what does Futuria do? We set out 2 years ago, having been using a bit of early AI and early as in generative AI in a consulting business. We just had this kind of belief that said there was something more fundamentally transformational, especially at the heart of highly assured, highly regulated businesses. I set out with a co-founder who'd got a background in the intelligence space and a co-founder who'd worked in the defense space. So in a sense, if you put together financial services and intelligence and defense, they're all, you can't just kind of turn up with a nice model one day and expect to implement it in those types of environment. They're environments that people are obsessed and thinking about data security and IP and confidentiality and personal data. So our quest, if you like, was how do we make sense of those that ecosystem, that kind of massive innovation, but in those secure environments. And as somebody said to me on my podcast the other day, Rob, she said, we don't care about how powerful, however more powerful your models are. talking about kind of the innovation around production of ever more powerful models. We care about what we do with it to make an impact on people's lives. And I know that's not an original statement, but it does encapsulate that point around in organizations of that type. How do we harness that power? And we set out doing that. We used to call it AI team members, but in a sense, we started mitigating the poor areas of models. So how do we fix hallucination? How do we connect it into enterprise tools or enterprise data sets? How do we give it teachability? How do we give it memory? But actually, what that's become is what the world tends to call agentic AI. Although I'm sure we'll cover that in a bit more detail downstream. But what we do as Futuria is we configure and deploy multi-agent teams to do complex work in secure enterprises. And I'm thinking very firmly about how do you do that at scale and how do you do that safely.
Now, you've seen some of these changes and transformations happen in organizations and the way in which they view technology. How are you seeing the hype around AI? Because, you know, even over the last year, I've started to see that there's a lot of interest, obviously, from the top, from people saying, right, we need to make AI a key part of our strategy for this year. And they're trying to sort of embed that through the organization. But they're also, the actual technology itself is still very new and, as we said earlier on, evolving all the time. So how do you see that sort of balance of the hype, people seeing it as magic, with the actual reality of being able to implement it? And particularly, you mentioned, we'll get onto Agentic more now, but you know, how are things like Agentic helping, or is it making the situation worse?
It feels a bit to me like the early days of cloud, in the sense that everything was cloud. It didn't matter. I mean, even kind of things that were patently not cloud in the kind of delivery of them were described that way. And I kind of, a few months ago, I remember getting quite ranty about this in the context of AI and agents, and because people were describing agents that just were not there, or the marketing materials describing visions that were just not the reality in the execution capability. But somebody, another guest on my podcast, said to me, Rob, what do you expect that they're going to say? And I think that was a fair thing, in the sense that everything on LinkedIn is about agents and agentic AI, isn't it? And therefore, if an organization didn't have something to say about that, well, that raises a massive question. I think the problem is that because everyone is now talking about it, it's inevitable that we're going to see what we are seeing. And I mean, there was the MIT report kind of recently that there's been much debate around on LinkedIn in terms of the 95% failing to kind of shift from POC. But that's probably an inevitability. People are rightly playing. It was important. Any organisation needs to dip a toe into this space to understand what the new art of the possible is, to understand and get a feel for what are the sets of skills that they will need as that organisation to be able to deliver things to enable them to credibly evolve and secure their future in this new AI-enabled world. So it's right to play. But there are way too few organizations thinking about this in the sense of how do we make it scale? How do we make it robust? How do we make it work in a large scale government department or a large scale global enterprise business? Because I mean, a lot of that innovation that's out there is focused around consumer and ease of adoption, isn't focused around people who've got that background as a CIO or COO or CEO going, but I've got to deliver this in a way that's consistent with the controls and the governance of my organization, that it's got to exist alongside my tech stack and tech capability and the way in which we kind of deliver data. I think the other complexity around is it does challenge some of the ways that we've all been conditioned to work as well. Time and time again, I say, don't think of it like a system. We've bought systems that kind of you go, this is what I want, and then build it, and it'll either work or it doesn't work. And I often talk about agents or multi-agent teams or agentic as, well, we can build something quick, like weeks. We can build something quick, days. But then you optimize it towards right. So it's not right or wrong to start with. It's more like a human. You're kind of bringing a capability into the organization and you're giving it data and tools and connectivity and knowledge, and it does a job, and that job is hopefully okay. But then you continue to make it better because you continue to work with it and you give it more data, or you give it more tool access, or you give it more agents within the agent team, or you train it. So it's that's a different mentality. And I think that's kind of one of the things that people, when people are looking at something and they say, oh, it doesn't work, well, interact with it then and make it better. It's a different way of working. So I
Yeah.
think there's lots of challenges to that point around. It's easy to do a POC. It's really hard to establish something and make it operational. We've had a live operational multi-agent team being used every day for the past year. I suspect there are very few organizations that have actually taken that plunge. And it's hard. I mean, I can say from the experience, that's hard because there's all sorts of things that you need to think about, but
Yeah.
it is possible.
Well, you talked about the sort of the governance side of things as well, and particularly you mentioned the regulated industries that you worked
Yeah.
with. I imagine that in those sectors, there's even more reluctance to experiment and test. I worked in the insurance sector for a little bit, trying to bring in machine learning tools and data science tools and that, and they were very risk averse, by their nature, right? So trying to sort of bring in that sort of mindset change was really hard. So how do you think you square those two things, that sort of risk averse mentality within regulated sectors with that need that you just explained there of being able to understand that things have to be iterated and you have to make a few mistakes, it's not going to be perfect?
I think in a say, I mean, great to pick insurance as an example. So I've got a guy coming on my podcast shortly. I've kind of been talking to, collaborating with, and he's built an insurance business with a person and a load of agents. And in a sense, I'm not suggesting that that is a scaled equivalent of an established insurance business that's been working for decades. But you can do that. And therefore, it's this thing around, if you're that established business
Hmm.
and that's the new art of the possible, that organization can exist, or I can find a way of scaling faster to deal with kind of particular events. Then you've got to think about, how's that going to disrupt my market and how do I respond to that? Now, the answer to that is not immediately, well, let's go and do the same, because you've got to do it in a controlled environment. But I still strongly believe that there are ways to do that that are safe. It's just kind of understand kind of how understand the depths of the technical environment and the data. I think a lot of it is kind of dependent on the data. I've seen so many people kind of stand up and say, oh, you need to make sure all your data's right, which I fundamentally disagree with. You need to make sure that kind of the sets of data that you want to utilize in the context of the use cases that you want to experiment with, you've got great data, but better to have some great data rather than try and kind of obsess around making all your data right. But understand that regulatory space, understand the controls, and then kind of look at some of the architectures that are available that could operate safely within that space to do something. And it comes back to, it's not as though there's a book that says everything's sorted. There isn't. So just recognize that that's a collaborative, innovative activity to find solutions that work, whether we're talking about insurance or banking or in the heart of the defense sector or national security. There are ways forward in all of those areas, but it's not about the power of the models. It's about providing a harness around the models that enables you to safely adopt them and safely use them within the spaces that they operate.
Yeah. And I liked your analogy with cloud, because when cloud came in, everyone was talking about cloud, suddenly became a bit of a buzzword, but actually the way people use it is very different. I mean, yes, there's the common standard code, but the way everyone uses it, different sizes, different speeds, different models. And it is the same, I think you're right, with various AI tools now, in that the actual way people use them is going to be very different. And you almost can't have one solution that's going to fit everyone's case, because it's all going to be very different. But I wonder if we can now look at sort of the human in the loop here, and the sort of human skills that are needed.
Yeah.
You've interacted with many senior people and big organizations, and we've talked about some of the sort of personality traits that would make a good leader in this space. I think curiosity is already, you mentioned, you've got this curiosity for emerging tech. What other aspects of a sort of leader's mindset do you think are necessary now for someone to be able to lead an organization through this AI transformation?
I don't think there's a single answer in that sense. So you're right. I mean, curiosity is a great one, and the desire to experiment and understand kind of a new art of the possible. I think another one is to just be able to maybe briefly forget what we know for a moment, to rediscover what could be kind of known. And why do I say that? I've got an increasing view over the last year that said, maybe if we were talking about aggregating data, you wouldn't need to do data warehousing or data lakes anymore. You'd use agents or agentic capability to provide dynamic links between disparate data sources. So you almost kind of access data at the point of need for the thing that you want to do. Now, if I start talking about that going into an organization, that's a future thought. It's not based on the reality of what we've known over the past 20 years. We're conditioned to kind of think that way because that's the environment in which we've operated. So that's what I mean by being able to slightly forget about what we know. Not everything. I just mean being open to new concepts, new ideas. I think I asked some of our customers, in terms of kind of who've worked with us, why did they choose to do the things that they did, and I loved this guy called Steve Smith, and he runs business, and I said to him, Steve, why did you do this? And he said, I wanted to make my people incredible. And I loved that, just as a phrase, because kind of in a world where we're all focused around the threat of AI, if you like, then that as a leader going, I want to give my people the tools to enable them to do their job better than anybody else, I just loved. And if I combine that with something else that I was told on my podcast, it was CEO in Kenya again, and she said, it's not AI that's going to take your job, it's the people who use AI that will take your job. Then that comes back to my point about experiment, and therefore leaders, whether you're the CEO or the CFO or the CIO, and I've spoken to all of those, and all of those have engaged us in doing this work. It's not about just tech. It's leaders in the business who go, we've got to do something different, and I am open to explore and experiment. But please be aware, Rob, these are the complexities of my environment, whatever they may be, in terms of regulation, control, legislation, whatever they might be. So we've got to find a way together.
Yeah. I also really love that phrase that you shared there about augmenting the human and being able to give them these superpowers leveraged on the technology, which is serving them rather than replacing them. And I really like that whole kind of concept. I also wanted to pick up on the mention you made of the chief AI officer as a particular role. I mean, that's something which I'm seeing more and more of now. There was a report which came out on the chief AI officer role from Bergman Holt a couple of months ago as well, where they sort of looked at this whole emerging space. What's your view on the type of role and function that the chief AI officer should have in an organization versus whether that should actually sit with the CEO or the COO? I mean, does it need to be separate, I suppose?
I don't think there's a single answer for it, because it just depends on the organization. Should there be somebody in an organization that has some deep expertise in aspects of AI, and of course, as we know, AI has been around for forever. So whether we're talking about AI, NLP, OCR, machine learning, as relevant as, yes, large language models and agents and kind of agentic and various other things. Should there be somebody in the organization who is on point to be the world's expert, if you like, in that space? Well, yeah, because you need, whether it's somebody or some group of people, you need somebody evangelizing a new art of the possible, or at least kind of providing guidance across the organization that says, yeah, don't do that, or consider that, or I've heard about this, or can you go and explore that? Um, because I think the biggest challenge with a lot of this is if you've got a superficial knowledge, and there are lots of kind of the market that's got a superficial knowledge, then that's probably why we're getting lots of proof of concepts that don't go anywhere, because you've got enough knowledge to be able to do something, but without understanding the depth. Now, whether they happen to be called a CAIO, or it's wrapped up in the CDO, or it's kind of part of the chief data officer, or I think matters less. What matters is you've got somebody in the organization who can kind of help the organization consider different ways of working. And I also think that they probably need to have quite a strong voice and personality, because if I go back to the early days of cloud, or kind of the early days of the chief digital officer role, I think there's a danger that it becomes a bit of that they're the evangelist. They're the kind of the person that's slightly on the side that kind of goes, "Hey, you should be doing that." And I think they need to be more embedded and more ability to kind of effect change, to lead change, drive change, rather than it being seen as somebody who's kind of read a few articles on a regular basis and is a point of contact. They need to be a leader,
Yeah.
and they need to be up for transformation at scale.
Yeah, and I think you, as you suggest there, they need to be integrated into the senior leadership team, and that's something which you can't just pluck somebody out without having had that leadership and management experience, who understands how to negotiate for budgets, how to drive technology transformation, enough about technology to be able to, well, ideally coming from a technology background or a technology company, to be able to facilitate that sort of transformation, and then bringing them in to have that holistic view of what it means to what AI means to the organization.
I think
Um,
I think if I can add just a key thing from my point of view, if I go back 7, 8 years to my old COO hat, driving kind of efficiency programs on a regular basis, still ensuring operational resilience and things of that nature. Then that was the days of people being really fearful around the jobs. Kind of when we were talking about efficiency, on the whole, that meant job cuts. And that's still kind of out there in terms. I mean, I still hear that kind of when we're talking about AI. But I have a strong belief that many organisations, and these are the conversations that I have with organisations, are struggling to recruit the capabilities that they need going forward. Whether that's volume or whether that's depth of expertise, they're not able to find the people in the market they need in the context of sustainability. Sustainability in terms of the business resilience, I hasten to make that. And therefore, we need to do something different anyway. The workforce of the future cannot be the same as the workforce of the past, even just based on basic demographics, and age, an aging population. So therefore, we have to do something different. So in a sense, whilst we've talked about the chief AI officer, then it's about transformational change for that organization anyway. So who is it who's looking out for what that organization needs to look like in 10 years? Who's thinking about my skills across the workforce? Who am I trying to recruit? What are the
yeah,
capabilities that I need to recruit? Because I can understand where AI is going to have the most impact in terms of the job functions, and what are those underlying traits, if you like, that I need in my future workforce.
and that's why I think it comes back to the role of the CEO or the COO, that they, typically that's where the strategy sits, and
Yeah,
rightly that's where, because they have the responsibility for driving the buses.
completely.
And so a lot of those things that you mentioned there should be their responsibility, rather than sort of almost like outsourcing it to a chief AI officer or someone
Yeah,
else. Um, so just in terms of then, I wanted to make sure we covered off Agentic as well. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you've got a lot of experience now of sort of seeing Agentic put into organizations. You mentioned you've been running systems for quite a long time now. Could you help us and the audience here, who are maybe sort of still getting up to speed with Agentic, could you give us a quick overview, almost like a definition of what Agentic is at an enterprise level, and then maybe an example of how that's been evolving over the last year or so?
Yeah, so I think I think the first thing I'd say is Futuria, we configure multi-agent teams. That we've done it for 2 years. That's our core focus in complex enterprises. And multi-agent teams are broadly agentic by nature, because within those multi-agent teams, you're going to have some degree of autonomous decision making by some of the agents in the tasks that they are doing within that team. Not every agentic solution is a multi-agent team. So if you like, every multi-agent team is probably agentic, but every agentic solution could be different. So you can have a single agent that could be agentic in the context of autonomous decision making within the confines of which where it's operating. So if you like, why do I say that? Because our focus is very much in the kind of multi-agent team space of agentic rather than everything that's agentic. Now, we often start by talking, in terms of the work we're doing with organizations, we often start by, if we were building the world's best team in your organization to solve a problem with the best expertise and the data they need to do the job and the tools that they need to do the job, then what would it look like? And in a sense, we then build that team using agents and people. And any organization could choose to have a different ratio, if you like, of the people and the agents, but it's about bringing those two capabilities together. Now, if people are uncomfortable with the concept around autonomous decision making at scale, then you put more people into that loop. And you can choose to do that in different ways, because if you're thinking about a task or a function or a workflow, then where do you want to have people engaged in that? What it's interesting, if I put my digital responsibility hat on, which I'm immersed in it for the last 10 years, then we place a lot of focus around the explainability of decisions, for example. So if I'm doing some work within a function, complex work, then you can dive in to see the work that the agent team is doing. But how many people are ultimately actually interested in that? Because you haven't got the capacity to do that for everything. If you're deploying agents to do work at scale, that's because they can do it faster. They can accelerate timescales. They drive that functional productivity, the efficiency of you doing that job. You haven't got enough humans to check all of that. So you almost got this kind of relationship that says, well, I'll put humans in a loop to do certain things to kind of give yourself the trust that's continuing to operate and not degrading in the thing that you're trying to do. So I think for us, agentic is getting the right balance between the autonomous decision making in part capability of agents operating with other agents and with humans to do functional work. And I mean, I published an article this week in collaboration with a couple of other experts talking about just that point around what does a high performing team look like in the future when we've got agents and people working collaboratively together, because there's all sorts of ways that we've looked at that: psychological profiling, bail bin, psychological safe, all sorts of things that we've done with humans. How does that work in a hybrid team?
Well, I'd love to pick your brains on this. I mean, this is fascinating, right? Because you're getting into the psychology now, because humans are used to dealing with humans, and we understand that whole process of HR. It's very valuable to help us to set out things like job descriptions and KPIs. But even with all of that, you still get a ton of friction between humans, within organizations. That's just the nature of humans working together. But now you think about those teams made up of humans plus the agents that you've outlined there. And humans being responsible for teams of humans and agents, how do you start to build things like job descriptions and KPIs and things like bonuses and remuneration when your teams are hybrid?
And I think let's be clear. Building agents and getting agents to collaborate together is really hard. I mean, it's really easy to build an agent, but getting an agent to do useful work in collaboration with other agents, that's a really hard thing. But I think even harder than that is motivating your workforce, your employee base, to want to proactively engage with these agents that we're bringing into the workforce.
Mm.
And if, for example, I mean, one of the use cases that I see that could be hugely valuable across public sector, certainly, and private sector, is there are a whole host of people like me, kind of with years of experience, that are going to retire over the next 5 years. And that know-how that's embedded in their experience, in their head, is phenomenally useful to the things that need to be conducted over the next 10, 20 years. And we can capture that in agentic teams. So we could logically, we can build out knowledge graphs that combine the knowledge of the business with the know-how of the individual, embed that in an agent or agent teams to be able to kind of do and advise on work going forward. But how do you motivate people to want to do that? How do you incentivize people to want to do that? What happens when they do retire in terms of that the rights to that and the commerciality of that? So there's lots of things that can be done, but there are lots of things that we need to solve, and especially we need to solve how do you create high performing teams of agents and people?
Mm. Well, it feels like that's the sort of the big challenge, in terms of we've been talking about how Agentic has evolved over the last year, because it really is, that's the sort of the timescale of it. But it's we started off talking about the technical evolution, but actually, you're right to point to the biggest challenge now is how we actually bring the human into that, and it's becoming back to being a human sort of organizational challenge again. And all of these transformations, I mean, they do come down to human challenges, right? It's always a kind of the human part is the bit which is hardest to solve. But just looking into the sort of the future now, what are the parts of agentic or AI that you're most excited about as you've started to, with your curious mind, scan that horizon and see things which are developing? Are there particular things that you're getting really excited about just over the horizon?
I think often it's as simple as just the ability to unlock things that we thought weren't possible. And what do I mean by that? So we're doing a piece of work at the moment um, in the US, and it's probably our most complex multi-agent team to date. So it's multiple single agents and multiple agent sub-teams coming together to do a particular bit of work. And I got back from holiday 4 weeks ago, and a person in the team leading that work said, "Oh, the output will be a PowerPoint." And I said, "No, we can't, we're not producing PowerPoints yet. Well, we can do Word documents, we can do Excel, but PowerPoint, we know kind of the construction of a automated construction of a PowerPoint, that's tricky." And then within 2 weeks, she'd done it. And that was a PowerPoint that aggregated charts, text, data analytics, images in a complex, long output report, effectively. I mean, it's not a board report, but think of it as production of a board report in PowerPoint. And
Mm.
and she did it. And I went, wow, okay. So and that's okay, that's an example. But I think what we've found is that it's continued stream of examples. We had another example recently where a guy that we're working with had said, "Oh, here's some unstructured data," and threw it across to us. And we looked at it and went, "Oh God, that's a bit challenging." Without going into the details, and we raised it, and he said, "Yeah, no, I knew it was. I was just kind of seeing how far you could kind of push the boundary." But with the next version that he sent, we'd kind of then got it ingested and an agent team using that data within a day. So the ability to consistently surprise ourselves, let alone anyone else, is I think the thing that's most exciting. Now, I did a piece of work last year, so about 18 months ago, multi-agent team doing effectively campaign marketing. And I was so we got tool interactions with some of the image generation, so mid-journey ideogram, etc. And I found it fascinating that just to watch the performance of those, well, both improve and decrease on a daily basis. So understanding kind of the nature of some of these tools when you're using a model, understanding how the model evolves on an almost daily basis, because getting that balance between optimizing for performing, but conscious that you can get degradation as well. So So it's a voyage of constant discovery, I think, is what I'm saying. And that's why I think it's so important, going back to the CAIO conversation, who in the business is looking out for all that innovation that's out there? Who's going, hey, I've seen this breakthrough, that one. And
Mm.
and I think it's the hardest thing. It's so much is changing so fast. You almost need an agent team to kind of summarize that to you on a daily basis to say, hey, these are the things I've spotted. Be aware of them. And now we've unlocked this, we can have a go at that one.
Great, there's our new business. Let's go and do that. I think
Yes,
you're.
yes. I'll
But
have
no,
it sorted by Monday.
yeah, or before then, by the sounds of it. But I think you're right, because there's this ongoing, constant change, which is both the technology and the way in which organisations have to adapt to that technology, which is accelerating in terms of the pace of change. And that's the biggest challenge here, is being able to stay up to date with that. One last question before we wrap up, then, because you got me thinking now about, you mentioned some of the other countries that you're working on, clients within those other countries. I've heard over the last month or so, people say that Agentic is something which the UK is very good at. And I just wanted to get your perspective on that. Are you seeing that we in the UK have a particular good, deep understanding of Agentic, or are other countries also developing it?
So if I kind of look at it in the context of um, have we in the UK got the appetite and the investment power to create ever more powerful models to compete with US or China? Probably not.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess. Can we find a way of harnessing that, using that in the right way, and innovating to do really important things in both government and private sector? Well, yeah, we've been doing that for years. So how do we drive forward on that, and how do we get that right balance between um, investment and incentive and government support and direction to be able to do that at pace? I think there's more that we can do in that all of that space. But absolutely, I mean, I think the thing that I'd say is nobody's cracked it anywhere in the world. So it's not as though anyone can say, hey, we are the global market leader for everything agentic. As you said, we only started using the term last summer. So we're really 1 year into it.
Mm.
At least in terms of execution capability. I mean, I've got into trouble before when I said none of us are experts, and then somebody said, "Well, I was studying this 20 years ago at university," and yes, they were academically, but now we can do that. We can make it reality in businesses with the technology and the tools that we have access to. So I think, yeah, there are some great conversations that I've seen happen in the UK, but we need to kind of do that faster and at scale. And I think we also need to kind of work a bit more on what are the capabilities and the skills that we need to do that most effectively, and how can we drive accelerated change in organizations? Because if I've got a fear, then my fear is that we've slightly lost the ability to be innovative and kind of just do stuff. I see it, and maybe that's a personal Rob thing, in the sense that I've shifted from a big organization to small organizations over the last 5 years. I operate at startup scale up speed, and I'm working with organizations that don't, and because they can't, because they're big and they've got governance. And but
Back
how
up.
but but if we can introduce pace into the work that we can, then I see no reason why we can't kind of create um, a space that's able to harness some of that innovation that's out there wherever it is in the world, choosing to do that in the most appropriate way in the context of the geopolitical place,
Yeah.
and make a real difference for UK businesses.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. The application layer is where the opportunity sits for the UK, because of all of the professional services that we have deep expertise in. And that's the area where we can start to build some of these use cases, some of these examples of how to use agentic and other technologies. And that's where then they become interesting to international clients.
And academia and universities. And I guess, look, I'm biased today because I think I said before we started, my daughter's just off to start her kind of first job, having just got her degree. But there's an interesting challenge out there at the moment, in the sense that I'd look to that future workforce as being kind of the innovators in this space, because they've got kind of fresh knowledge, fresh thinking. They are kind of using those emerging technologies and thoughts. You don't need 20, 30 years of expertise to do amazing things in an emergent space that we're operating in. But at the same time, of course, they're probably most at threat from a lot of the automation and AI adoption that could be occurring in organizations. Comes back to that consulting industry podcast that I said that I'd done the other day. Logically, you can use agents to do what a junior consultant may otherwise have done. So I think one of the things that we need to solve is how do we create this kind of raft of opportunities for people coming out of academia into the workforce and really kind of harness their passion and insight and ability to just do stuff, not conditioned by the fact that they've been doing things this way for the last 20, 30 years, as maybe a lot of others in the workforce are. Both are important. We've got to kind of, because it comes back to, you've got to be conscious of the controls that you need and the governance, but let's harness the innovative capability from that new wave of people coming into the workforce too.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to reflect it back in the word that you used quite early on in this episode, where you talk about augmenting, and I think that's it. That's something that we're going to see much more conversation about. How do we augment the human using all the things you've just been describing? But
absolutely.
I'm going to have to start wrapping things up there. I was going to say that we could talk for hours, but we have already been talking for hours across various other podcasts. So I always enjoy talking to you, Rob, because you're so knowledgeable. And I think there's a lot. We'll have to get you back in again soon, or maybe even do a webinar and do a deep dive into Agentic, because there's lots of really good stuff there, and Agentic is going to be so important over the next few months. As well. But just a closing thought from you then, and then we'll sort of finish. But if you had to sort of ask a question to the audience to help them prepare for what's coming up over the next few months, what sort of question would you ask them?
Wow. I think in a sense, I'm going to do it in the context of a question for the industry in terms of providing solutions in, because it comes back to what we need to get to is not 95% of things not moving beyond POP, but the majority of things moving beyond. And to do that, then I think what we've got to do is get this better balance between the understanding of enterprise organizations and government departments in terms of the controls, the governance, and the ability of the industry to satisfy that, but also bring the innovation to bear. So probably the question would be around how we make that happen. So I've talked over the last, for anyone who's looked at me on LinkedIn recently, I've been publishing a series of articles which are very much spinning it round. So rather than this is what we can do as an AI company, this is what you have to do as the organization to enable you to adopt. So you've got to think about things like safety and trust. You've got to think about things like governance and control, quality and performance. At that point, we discussed around high-performing hybrid teams. So just set out kind of what your organization, what needs to be true for your organization to adopt agents at scale. That would be my question.
Yeah. I like that. What needs to be true for your organization to operate at scale? So really, so that strategic question that makes you think about all the ingredients you need to have in place. Amazing. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been great, and we'll definitely get you back in and do more stuff. Oh, one last thing, just how do we stay in touch with you to follow all of these podcasts and other reports? What's the best way for people to look you up?
So find me, Rob Price, on LinkedIn, publish everything kind of through there. My podcast is on all the usual platforms. It's Futurise, Futurise, and broadly one comes out every couple of weeks. And I speak at lots of events, meetups in London, etc. Hopefully kind of I'll be a regular, well, I will be a regular at UK AI events. I'll be there on the 2nd of September as an example. So yeah, I'm easy to find. Because I'm noisy on online, really.
Brilliant. And it is the real Rob, not Agentic Rob. Amazing. So, Rob, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you again soon.
Tim, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.